The mountain released Elias Crow at dawn, sending him down the narrow trail with 3 months of pelts and a gnawing need for coffee that didn't taste of smoke. His mule picked its way through scattered shale while Cedar Falls spread below like a half-remembered dream, its new railroad tracks catching the early light like scars across the valley floor. He hadn't meant to stay away so long, but mountains kept their own time, and his cabin asked nothing of him except honest labor. Down there, in that cluster of fresh-painted buildings and ambitious souls, people expected conversation, manners, explanations for why a man chose altitude over company. The general store would be opening soon. Masters would count his pelts, make his offers, and the town ladies would whisper behind their gloved hands about the hermit from Eagle Peak. Then came the train whistle, sharp and urgent, pulling his attention toward the depot where a crowd was gathering. Before we continue, please leave a like and let me know which city you're watching from. Now, let's get back to the story. Margaret Hale sat on the depot platform bench with her spine straight as a schoolroom ruler, though everything inside her threatened to crumble like week-old bread. The telegram in her lap had been read so many times the paper had gone soft at the creases, but the words remained sharp as broken glass. Too old. Arrangement canceled. Do not come. H. Westbrook. 10 words. 25 cents to destroy 3 months of correspondence and careful planning. The morning crowd grew around her like curious chickens, pecking at the edges of her humiliation. She recognized the station master's nervous shuffle, the way he cleared his throat before speaking words nobody wanted to hear. "Ma'am, the westbound train leaves in 2 hours, he said, twisting his cap. Perhaps you'd like to, that is, there's no shame in returning home. Home, Margaret almost laughed. She'd sold everything to afford this journey her mother's pearl brooch, the piano that had stood in the parlor for 20 years, even the maple bed frame her father had carved for her trousseau. There was no home to return to, just a rented room in Baltimore and a teaching position she'd abandoned for the promise of a new life in Colorado territory. "The lady's situation is most unfortunate," Mrs. Pritchard announced to her circle of town matrons, loud enough for Margaret to hear. "These matrimonial arrangements through the mail, well, what does one expect a woman of her age should have known better?" Margaret's fingers tightened on the telegram. 46 years old. She'd written it plainly in her third letter, not wanting deception. Harold had written back that he admired her honesty, that he sought a mature woman's wisdom for his household. Fool that she was. She'd believed him. The crowd parted suddenly, and Margaret looked up to see a mountain of a man standing before her. Not a mountain, a man who belonged to mountains, with shoulders broad enough to carry timber and hands scarred from honest work. His beard was freshly trimmed, but his clothes spoke of high altitude and solitude. He smelled of pine sap and wood smoke. "Ma'am," he said, and his voice was low as distant thunder. "You need help with that bag." The Saratoga trunk beside her held everything she owned, her mother's Bible with pressed violets between the pages, the teaching certificate from Maryland Normal School, 3 calico dresses, and the daguerreotype of her parents on their wedding day. She'd imagined unpacking it in Harold Westbrook's house, hanging her dresses in a real wardrobe, placing the Bible on a bedside table that belonged to her. "I can manage," she said, though she couldn't. The trunk was too heavy, the boarding house too expensive, and the weight of public shame too much to bear. But she'd learned long ago that admitting weakness only invited more pain. The man didn't move. He studied her with eyes the color of winter sky, taking in her traveling dress, her best wool, now wrinkled from a night spent dozing upright on the train, and the jet mourning brooch at her throat, worn not for death but for respectability. When their eyes met, she saw something unexpected there. Not pity, which she couldn't have borne, nor the predatory interest of men who sensed vulnerability. Instead, she saw recognition. "Elias Crow," he said, removing his hat. "I keep a cabin up on Eagle Peak. Margaret Hale." She was surprised her voice remained steady. "Recently of Baltimore." "Not so recent anymore. Seems like—" The comment should have stung, but something in his tone made it feel more like understanding than judgment. He nodded toward the general store across the street. Masters serves decent coffee. Might help with the planning. I don't need... She stopped. Pride was a luxury she couldn't afford. And this stranger was the first person all morning who'd addressed her directly rather than discussing her like livestock at auction. That's kind of you, Mr. Crow. He picked up her trunk as if it weighed nothing, then offered his free arm. She stood on unsteady legs. She'd been sitting on that bench for 3 hours, ever since the morning train discharged her into this nightmare, and placed her hand lightly on his sleeve. The crowd parted again, but this time their whispers followed in their wake. That's the hermit from Eagle Peak. What's he doing with that poor woman? Maybe he's helping her to the boarding house. But Elias Crow didn't lead her toward the boarding house. He walked straight to the general store, set her trunk carefully by the door, and held it open for her to enter. The interior was dim and cool, smelling of coffee beans and leather and possibility. 2 cups, Masters, Elias called to the proprietor, and privacy. Masters, a thin man with oil-slicked hair, looked from Elias to Margaret with obvious curiosity. The lady might prefer the boarding house parlor. The lady prefers coffee, Margaret said, surprising herself. Strong, if you please. Elias almost smiled. Then she saw it in the slight softening around his eyes. He led her to a small table by the window where they could see the depot, but the crowd couldn't peer in at them. When he pulled out her chair, his hands were gentle despite their size. Now then, Miss Hale, he said, settling across from her. Tell me about this Harold Westbrook who doesn't know quality when it's standing right in front of him. For the first time since receiving the telegram, Margaret felt the tight band around her chest begin to loosen. This strange, soft-spoken mountain man had given her what no one else had offered all morning: dignity. And in that moment, sitting in a general store that smelled of promises rather than endings, Margaret began to wonder if perhaps she hadn't reached her destination after all. Perhaps she'd only just arrived at the beginning. The boarding house mistress, Mrs. Dorothea Crane, looked Margaret up and down with the calculating eye of someone who'd learned to profit from desperation. Her establishment sat 2 blocks from the depot, a narrow 3-story building with lace curtains that couldn't quite hide the peeling paint beneath the windowsills. $4 for the week, Mrs. Crane announced, her chin lifting with false authority. Payment in advance. Your sign says $2, Margaret said quietly. That's for respectable guests. Unaccompanied women bring trouble. The woman's gaze slid to Elias, who'd insisted on carrying Margaret's trunk to the parlor. And gentlemen callers are only permitted between 2 and 4 in the afternoon, properly chaperoned. Margaret felt heat rise in her cheeks. $4 would leave her with exactly $3.40 to her name. Not enough for a train ticket back east, barely enough for meals. She opened her purse with steady fingers, though her mind raced through impossible calculations. The lady won't be needing the room, Elias said. Both women turned to stare at him. He stood by the horsehair settee, his hat in his hands, looking as out of place in the Victorian parlor as a bear in a tea shop. The kerosene lamp cast shadows across his weathered face, making him seem older than his years, though Margaret guessed he couldn't be past 50. I beg your pardon. Mrs. Crane's voice went shrill. Elias addressed Margaret directly, ignoring the landlady. We need to finish our conversation. Miss Hale, about that business proposition I mentioned. Margaret followed him back to the general store, her trunk once again in his capable hands. Masters had left a pot of coffee on the wood stove, and the blue willow china cups waited on the same table by the window. The afternoon sun slanted through the glass, turning the dust motes into tiny golden prayers. Elias poured coffee with surprising delicacy, then set down his cup with the same careful precision. I got a cabin needs keeping, and you need a roof. Neither of us is fool enough to expect love songs. What say we try for respect and see where it leads? The words hung in the air between them like morning mist. Margaret's hand trembled slightly as she reached for her cup. Mr. Crow, are you suggesting marriage, legal and proper? He leaned back in his chair, which creaked under his weight. I know how it sounds. Man you met 2 hours ago proposing matrimony over coffee in a general store. But hear me out. Che. Margaret found herself nodding, though her rational mind screamed warnings. What else could she do? Listen to another proposition that might be far worse. I've lived alone on Eagle Peak for 8 years, Elias continued. Had a wife once, Jenny. She died trying to give me a son. Buried them both on a hill where the sunrise hits first. He paused, his fingers tracing the rim of his cup. Swore I'd never put another woman through that life. It's hard living harder than anything you've known in Baltimore. I'm stronger than I look, Margaret said. I believe you are. His eyes met hers, steady and serious. Here's what I'm offering: honest work, clean air, nobody to judge what you were before. The cabin's solid, I built it myself. There's a good spring for water, a root cellar, a vegetable garden that needs tending. Game's plentiful if you're not particular about eating venison and rabbit. Town's a day's ride when you need supplies or company. And what would you expect of me? Margaret kept her voice level, though her heart hammered against her corset stays. Cooking, cleaning, the things that make a house a home, which I've done poorly these 8 years. He shifted in his seat. I've got 2 bedrooms. You'd have your own unless we decided different. I'm not looking for a warm bed. Miss Hale had that with Jenny, and losing it nearly killed me. I'm looking for partnership. Someone to share the work and maybe, someday, the silence that comes after. Margaret studied his face, searching for deception or hidden cruelty. She found neither. Instead, she saw a man who'd learned to live with loneliness, but hadn't learned to like it. She thought of her alternatives: the boarding house she couldn't afford, the teaching position she'd abandoned, the whispers that would follow her whether she stayed or went. You don't know anything about me, she said. Know you came out here brave enough to marry a stranger. Know you held your dignity when that fool threw you over. Know you've got education, can see it in how you hold yourself, how you speak. He paused. Know you're considering my offer instead of slapping me for impropriety, which means you're practical as well as proud. Despite everything, Margaret almost smiled. When would this marriage take place? Judge Patterson's in his office until 5. We could walk over now, be legal before supper. He pulled out a worn leather wallet. $1 for the license, another $1 for the judge's fee. I've got enough for that, and supplies to see us through winter. This is madness, Margaret said. But even as she spoke, she felt something shift inside her chest. Not hope exactly, she'd learned the danger of hope, but possibility. Maybe, Elias agreed. But it's practical madness. What do you say, Miss Hale? She thought of Harold's telegram, of Mrs. Crane's contempt, of the crowd at the depot discussing her like she was already a ghost. Then she thought of this man who'd offered her coffee and dignity and a chance to disappear into mountains where no one would whisper about the spinster who'd been fool enough to believe in love. I say yes, Mr. Crow. They walked to the courthouse together, her hand on his arm, her trunk left in Master's storeroom for safekeeping. Judge Patterson was a round man with mutton-chop whiskers who didn't seem surprised to see them. Marriage license, Elias. He looked from the mountain man to Margaret with interest but not judgment. This the lady from the train. This is Miss Margaret Hale, Elias said firmly. My intended. The judge's wife, summoned from upstairs, served as witness. She was a small, bird-like woman who pressed Margaret's hand kindly and whispered, Elias is a good man, dear. Better than most who make prettier promises. The ceremony was brief, 5 minutes of legal words that transformed 2 strangers into husband and wife. Margaret signed the certificate with a steady hand, though her new name looked foreign on the paper, Margaret Crow. Elias signed more slowly, his letters carefully formed as though writing itself was still a challenge. When Judge Patterson pronounced them married, Elias didn't kiss her. Instead, he took her hand, his palm calloused but gentle, and said quietly, "Thank you, Mrs. Crow, Mrs. Crow." She'd imagined hearing those words from Harold Westbrook in a church with organ music and orange blossoms. Instead, she heard them in a courthouse that smelled of old wood and tobacco, from a man whose last name she'd worn for less than a minute. "What now?" she asked as they stepped into the late afternoon sun. "Now we get supplies," Elias said, practical as always. "Then tomorrow, we go home." Home. Such a simple word for such a complicated journey. But as Margaret walked beside her new husband toward the general store, she realized that for the first time all day, she wasn't looking back toward the depot and the life that had abandoned her. She was looking ahead, toward mountains she'd never seen and a future she'd never imagined. It wasn't the ending she'd planned. But perhaps her fingers tightened slightly on Elias's arm. Perhaps it was the beginning she needed. The morning after their courthouse wedding dawned clear and cold, with frost silvering the boardwalk outside Master's general store. Margaret stood before a long mirror in the back room where Master's wife had laid out practical clothing, her traveling dress already folded into her trunk. "Can't ride a mountain trail in that bustle, Mrs. Masters said kindly, holding up a simple calico dress in brown and blue check. "This was my daughter's before she married and moved to Denver. You're about her size." Margaret fingered the fabric, sturdy cotton. Well made but plain. Nothing like the Baltimore fashions she'd left behind. "How much did—" Elias already settled it. Mrs. Masters said, "The boots, too. Can't have you climbing Eagle Peak in those city shoes." The boots were brown leather, barely worn, lacing up past her ankles. Margaret had never worn anything so practical, so entirely without beauty for its own sake. When she emerged from the back room, Elias was loading supplies into canvas panniers, his movements efficient and practiced. He looked up at her transformation and nodded once. "Better. That dress won't catch on branches." If he noticed that she'd gone from city lady to frontier woman in the span of 20 minutes, he didn't comment further. Margaret watched him work, cataloging their supplies: 50 pounds of flour in cotton sacks, salt pork wrapped in brown paper, coffee beans, salt, baking soda, a precious tin of baking powder. He added wool blankets, 2 of them, thick enough to stop wind, canning jars nested in straw, their glass catching the morning light, a paper of needles, several skeins of thread, a length of calico that could become curtains or shirts as needed. "You know what you're doing," she observed. 8 years of practice." He secured the last strap. "Would have bought more, but we need to pack light for the climb. I'll come back before the snow gets serious." Margaret had never considered that supplies had to be carried up a mountain on horseback, that every pound of flour or sugar had to be balanced against what an animal could bear. In Baltimore, groceries arrived by delivery wagon. Here, Elias weighed each purchase against the strength of his horses. He'd brought 2 horses down from the mountain, his own bay gelding and a gentle mare he'd borrowed from a neighbor. The side saddle had been modified with a broader seat and an additional grip bar. "Never used a side saddle before, Jenny," he admitted, checking the cinch. "She insisted on propriety even on the mountain after well, I kept it. Don't know why." Margaret heard what he didn't say, that he'd kept his wife's saddle for 8 years, unable to sell it, unable to throw it away, as if some part of him knew another woman might need it someday. She mounted carefully, her new boots finding the stirrup, her hands gripping both the pommel and the bar Elias had added. "We'll take it slow," he said, swinging onto his own horse with the ease of a man born to the saddle. 6 hours if the weather holds, maybe 7 with rest stops. They rode out of Cedar Falls as the sun climbed higher, painting the valley gold. A few early risers watched from windows and doorways the hermit and his sudden bride, heading up the mountain toward a life none of them could imagine. Margaret kept her chin high, her back straight, though her stomach churned with more than just wedding nerves. The first hour was deceptively easy, following a wagon road that served the lower homesteads. They passed a few farms carved from the forest, smoke rising from chimneys, children pausing in their chores to stare. Elias nodded to each family but didn't stop to introduce his bride. That would come later. Margaret understood. First, she had to survive the climb. The wagon road ended at a rushing creek, and the real trail began. It was barely wide enough for a single horse, switching back and forth across the mountain's face like a drunk man's walk. The trees closed in pine and aspen and fir, their branches sometimes brushing Margaret's shoulders. Her mare picked her way carefully, seeming to know each root and rock. "Trust the horse," Elias called back. "She knows the way better than you do." Trust the horse. Trust the man. Trust that she hadn't just made the worst mistake of her 46 years. Margaret gripped the saddle horn tighter as the trail climbed higher, the valley spreading out below them like a map growing ever smaller. She could see Cedar Falls now, just a cluster of buildings beside the railroad tracks that had brought her here. They stopped after 2 hours at a flat spot beside a spring. Elias helped her dismount, his hands steady at her waist, then offered her water from a canteen and a piece of pemmican dried meat and berries pressed together, dense as a brick and twice as unappetizing. "Traveling food," he explained. "Fills the stomach without weighing down the pack." Margaret nibbled the edge, finding it better than expected, salty and slightly sweet, with a tang that might have been Saskatoon berries. She watched Elias check the horse's hooves for stones, adjust the pack straps, all the small acts of care that kept them safe on the narrow trail. "How did you choose Eagle Peak?" she asked. "It chose me." He looked up at the peaks rising above them, still snow-capped even in early September. "After Jenny died, I couldn't stay in town. Too many memories. Too many people wanting to help when all I wanted was quiet. Kept climbing until I found a place that felt far enough away. From what? From everything that reminded me I'd failed to keep her safe." The honesty of it struck Margaret like cold wind. She understood that kind of running. She'd done it herself, fleeing Baltimore and its careful social structures for a promise of new life. They were both refugees, she realized, seeking altitude as cure for heartbreak. The afternoon climb was harder. The trail narrowed until Margaret could have touched the rock wall on her right while looking down a stomach-dropping slope on her left. This was the moment from her imagination made real, gripping the saddle horn with white knuckles, keeping her eyes fixed on Elias's broad back, choosing to trust because the alternative was paralysis. "Almost there," he said, though they'd been climbing for 4 hours. "Just past this ridge." Past the ridge. The trail widened into a meadow dotted with wildflowers going to seed. The late afternoon sun slanted across the grass, turning everything golden, and Margaret forgot her fear in the sheer beauty of it. Mountains rose on 3 sides, protective walls of stone and snow. An eagle circled overhead, riding thermals she couldn't feel. "It's magnificent," she breathed. "Wait until you see the sunset," Elias said, and she heard pride in his voice for the first time. They climbed another hour through forest that gradually thinned, the trees growing shorter and more twisted as altitude took its toll. Margaret's back ached and her legs had gone numb. But she didn't complain. She'd claimed to be strong. Now she had to prove it. The cabin appeared just as the sun touched the western peaks, turning the sky into a canvas of gold and rose and purple. It sat in a small clearing beside a creek. Solid log walls chinked with white clay, a stone chimney already releasing a thin thread of smoke. You left a fire burning, banking coals, easier than starting fresh. Elias dismounted and reached up to help her down. "Welcome home, Mrs. Crow." Home. Margaret's legs nearly buckled when they touched ground, 8 hours in the saddle having taken their toll. Elias steadied her, then stood back to let her look. The cabin was larger than she'd expected, maybe 20 feet by 30, with real glass windows and a covered porch across the front. A vegetable garden stretched along the south side. Gone wild with neglect, but still producing, she could see tomato plants heavy with fruit, squash vines tangled among the weeds. A small barn stood to the west, its door standing open to reveal stalls for the horses and storage for hay. "You built all this." "Had help with the barn. Rest I did myself." He shifted uncomfortably. "It ain't much, but it's never leaked. Root cellar stays cool all summer. Spring water's sweet as any you'll taste. Margaret heard the anxiety in his voice. This man who'd faced mountain winters and bears and 8 years of solitude was nervous about her opinion of his home. She touched his arm gently. "It's perfect, Mr. Crow." "Elias," he said. "Figure we should use first names, being married and all. Then you must call me Margaret." They stood there in the dying light, two strangers bound by law and necessity, looking at the cabin that would shelter whatever they would become. The sunset painted the logs gold and threw their shadows long across the clearing. In the distance, a wolf howled lonely sound that raised the hair on Margaret's neck. "They don't come close," Elias said. "Nothing does, except the deer that eat the garden." He showed her inside as darkness fell, lighting a kerosene lamp that threw warm light across surprisingly civilized space. The main room held a stone fireplace large enough to cook in, a table and 2 chairs he'd clearly made himself, shelves lined with books she hadn't expected. A rifle hung above the door, and traps dangled from pegs on the wall, but there were also curtains at the windows, faded blue calico that spoke of Jenny's touch. "Your room's through here," Elias said, opening a door to reveal a small but clean space with a rope bed, a washstand, and another window looking east toward tomorrow's sunrise. "I'll bring your trunk in directly." Margaret sat on the bed, testing its give, imagining the mornings she'd wake here. Through the walls, she could hear Elias moving in the main room, the domestic sounds of a man preparing supper. She'd climbed a mountain today, left behind everything she'd known for a life she couldn't yet imagine. Her wedding night would be spent alone in a narrow bed, her husband separated by walls both literal and metaphorical. It wasn't what she'd dreamed as a girl, wasn't what she'd expected even yesterday. But as she unlaced her new boots and felt the solid floor beneath her feet, Margaret realized she felt something she hadn't experienced in months. She felt safe. Margaret woke to unfamiliar silence. No street vendors calling their wares, no clatter of wagon wheels on cobblestones, no church bells marking the hour. Just the soft whisper of wind through pine and the distant sound of water running over stone. Gray light filtered through the calico curtains, suggesting dawn was still making up its mind about arriving. She rose from the rope bed, its straw tick mattress rustling beneath her, and noticed something she'd been too exhausted to see the night before. On the windowsill sat a mason jar filled with wildflowers, Indian paintbrush and columbine, their colors muted in the dim light. They were fresh, perhaps picked yesterday before Elias had descended to town. He'd prepared for her arrival before he even knew she existed. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. "Margaret, coffee's ready when you are." She dressed quickly in the calico dress, pinned up her hair without a mirror, and emerged to find Elias standing by the stove, 2 tin cups steaming on the table. He'd already been outside, his boots were damp with dew. "I'll show you around proper this morning," he said, not quite meeting her eyes. "So you know where everything is." They started with the cabin itself, Elias explaining each room with the careful precision of a man who'd built every board and beam. The main room served triple-duty kitchen, dining, and living space. The cook stove dominated one wall, cast iron and impressive, with a water reservoir on its side. "Keeps water warm all day once the fire's going," he explained. Jenny insisted on it, said hot water was civilization's greatest gift. The second bedroom, his room, was barely glimpsed through the doorway. Spartan and neat, with a larger bed and a trunk at its foot. He moved past it quickly, respecting the boundary they'd silently established. "Root cellars through here." He lifted a trap door in the kitchen floor, revealing wooden steps descending into darkness. The smell of earth and stored vegetables rose to meet them. "Stays 40 degrees year-round. Keeps potatoes and carrots through winter. Canned goods safe from freezing." Margaret descended carefully, finding shelves lined with dusty jars, some empty, others filled with preserved foods gone dark with age. "These need clearing out," she observed. "Haven't had much heart for canning since—" He trailed off. "The supplies are good, though. Vinegar, salt. What you'll need for putting up fresh." Outside, he showed her the smokehouse, small but functional, with hooks for hanging meat and shelves for the slow smoking process. that would preserve their winter protein. The barn held more surprises, not just stalls for the horses, but a workshop with tools, a grindstone for sharpening, and a loft filled with hay. "Cut it from the lower meadow each summer," Elias said. "Enough for the horses and then some." But it was the water system that truly impressed her. Elias had diverted part of the creek through wooden pipes he'd hollowed himself, creating a gravity-fed system that brought fresh water to within 20 feet of the cabin. "No hauling buckets from the creek in winter," he said with quiet pride. "Pipes buried deep enough it won't freeze." Margaret marveled at the ingenuity. "You're quite the engineer." "Just practical, living alone. You find ways to make the work easier." Back inside, Margaret surveyed the kitchen area with new eyes. The shelves held mismatched dishes, some china that must have been Jenny's, some tin for everyday use. Cast iron pans hung from hooks, seasoned black as midnight. She found flour in a wooden bin, protected from mice, and a crock of sourdough starter bubbling quietly in the corner. "Been feeding that starter for 8 years, Elias said. "Gets temperamental if you neglect it." "Like the stove, I imagine." Margaret opened the firebox, studying the bed of coals. "Each one has its own personality. This one runs hot, half the wood you'd think you need, or you'll roast yourself out of the kitchen." She spent the morning learning the stove's quirks, how to adjust the damper just so, where the hot spots were for quick boiling versus slow simmering. Elias worked nearby, sharpening knives and repairing a trap, but always within earshot if she had questions. For lunch, she made biscuits, her first attempt with his temperamental stove. They came out lopsided but edible, and Elias ate 3 without comment on their appearance. She'd found a pot of venison stew he'd left simmering overnight, flavored with wild onions and herbs she couldn't identify. "What's your routine?" she asked as they ate. "Your daily schedule." "Check the trap lines early, before the ravens get to them. Hunt when meat's low. Firewood's a constant, takes a cord a month to heat through winter. Garden in summer, preserving in fall." He paused. "I'm gone sometimes. Overnight if the hunting's poor." "You'd be alone." "I've been alone before," Margaret said quietly. "Different alone up here. No neighbors to call on. No help if something goes wrong." "Boo. Then you'll have to teach me what could go wrong and how to fix it." He looked at her then, really looked at her, and she saw something shift in his expression. "You mean to stay? Did you think I wouldn't?" "Thought you might try for a month, maybe 2. Wait for the first big snow, then ask to go back down." Margaret set down her cup with deliberate precision. "Elias, I sold everything I owned for train fare. I have no family, no position waiting for me, and no romantic notions about starting over at 46. I'm not here on a whim. I'm here because you offered a partnership, and I accepted. I mean to hold up my end. That include learning to shoot." The question surprised her. "If necessary." "It's necessary. Bears mostly leave you alone, but a mother with cubs doesn't think twice. Mountain cats are worse silent until they're not. And sometimes—" He hesitated. "Sometimes men come through. Trappers, mostly. Prospectors. Most are harmless, but a woman alone needs to be able to protect herself." "Then you'll teach me." That afternoon, she reorganized the kitchen with scientific efficiency, creating zones for preparation, cooking, and cleaning. She found a slate tucked behind the flour bin and mounted it on the wall for household accounts. The Montgomery Ward catalog from 1879 served as reference for prices and possibilities. "We could order window glass for the bedroom," she suggested, noting a broken pane patched with oilcloth. "And perhaps Fuller's Earth for spring cleaning." "Make a list," Elias said. "I'll take it down next trip." As evening approached, they fell into a routine without discussing it. Elias brought in firewood while Margaret prepared supper. She found preserved peaches in the root cellar, the jar dated in Jenny's careful hand August 1879. 5 years old, but the seal was good. She opened them with ceremony, serving them alongside fresh biscuits and the last of the venison stew, Haven't had those in years, Elias said, savoring the sweetness. Were you saving them? Maybe. Or maybe I just forgot they were down there. He pushed the last peach toward her. You take it. We'll share, she said, cutting it neatly in half. After supper, Elias showed her his evening routine, banking the fire for the night, checking the door latch, setting water to heat for morning. Margaret washed dishes in the basin, using lye soap that took the skin off her hands, but left everything spotless. I could make gentler soap, she offered, with bacon grease and wood ash. My mother taught me. Be grateful for it. Winter's hard on the skin up here. They sat by the fire as darkness settled over the mountain. Not quite comfortable, but not entirely awkward either. Elias worked on mending a bridle while Margaret examined his small library, mostly practical books on farming and building, but also a Bible, some Shakespeare, and surprisingly, a volume of romantic poetry. Jenny's, he said without looking up. She liked pretty words. And you. I like useful words. But sometimes, he shrugged, sometimes pretty has its place. Margaret selected the Shakespeare, reading by lamplight while Elias worked. The fire crackled, the wind picked up outside, and somewhere in the distance, an owl called. It was domestic in a way she hadn't expected two people sharing space without demanding conversation. I should turn in, Elias said eventually. Dawn comes early. You need anything? No, thank you. I have everything I need. He paused at his bedroom door. Margaret. The flowers, if they bother you, reminding you of... I can take them out. She understood what he was asking. Did the gesture meant for an unknown bride pain her, knowing she was second choice for him as he'd been for her? They're lovely. Elias. Thank you for thinking of it. He nodded and disappeared into his room, closing the door softly. Margaret banked the fire as he'd shown her, checked the door latch, and carried the lamp to her own room. The flowers on the windowsill had opened fully in the warmth, their faces turned toward where tomorrow's sun would rise. She changed into her nightgown, settled into the rope bed with its rustling mattress, and listened to the night sounds of her new home. Through the walls, she could hear Elias moving about, then the creak of his bed taking his weight. They were married but separate, together but apart. Two planets circling the same sun but maintaining careful distance. It wasn't the wedding night she'd imagined as a girl, but as Margaret pulled the quilt up to her chin, Jenny's quilt, she realized. Feeling the careful stitching, she felt something she hadn't expected. Peace. They would build something here. She and this quiet man with his water systems and wildflowers. Not a love story, perhaps, but something solid and real. Tomorrow she would learn to make sourdough bread. Tomorrow she would start clearing the garden. Tomorrow she would continue becoming Margaret Crow, mountain woman. Tonight, she would sleep in her own room, in her own bed, with her dignity intact and her future, while uncertain, at least her own to shape. The wind sang through the pines, and Margaret slept. September brought crisp mornings to Eagle Peak, the kind that painted frost on grass and made breath visible in the dawn air. Margaret had been on the mountain 2 weeks now, long enough to establish routines, but not long enough to feel truly at home. She stood at the creek with Elias, watching him point out the subtle signs she'd never have noticed on her own. See how the moss grows only on the north side of these rocks. He crouched beside the water, his large hand gentle as it touched the velvet green growth. Always does in these parts. If you're ever turned around, moss'll point you home. Margaret knelt beside him, her skirts catching on the rough ground. She'd taken to wearing her oldest calico for these morning lessons, knowing she'd return mud-stained and bramble-torn. And these marks on the bark, elk. They rubbed the velvet off their antlers late summer. Fresh marks mean they're close. Old ones, like these, tell you this is their regular path. He stood, offering her his hand up. Everything up here leaves signs. You just need to learn the language. They moved along the creek, Elias identifying plants as they went. Yarrow for wounds, willow bark for fever, pine pitch for ceiling cuts. He showed her the difference between mushrooms that would flavor stew and ones that would end her life, between berries that would preserve well and those that would ferment to uselessness. "This here's bear clover," he said, indicating a low-growing plant with waxy leaves. "Bears bed down in it, but more important, it only grows above 4,000 feet. You see this? You know you're high enough that water runs clean." "How did you learn all this?" Margaret asked, filling her gathering basket with rose hips he'd identified as perfect for tea. "Some from my father, before he died. Some from an old Ute trapper who wintered with me my second year up here. Rest from making mistakes and surviving them." They spent the morning walking his trap lines, Elias explaining the rotation system he used to avoid depleting any one area. He showed her how to read the sky for weather changes, the way clouds built against the peaks before storms, how the wind shifted direction 12 hours before precipitation. "Mare's tails," he said, pointing to high, wispy clouds, "means weather change within 2 days, usually wind first, then whatever moisture is coming." Margaret took mental notes, occasionally jotting observations in a small notebook she'd found in the cabin. Education had always been her strength, and she approached mountain living like she'd once approached her teaching certificate, with methodical determination to master every lesson. The third trap held a rabbit, still warm, neck broken clean by the spring mechanism. Elias reset the trap while Margaret watched, memorizing the process. "Could you eat it?" he asked. "If you had to dress it yourself." "I've cleaned chickens," she said. "This can't be much different." "I'll teach you tomorrow. Rabbit's good practice before winter, when we'll need to process deer." They returned to the cabin for lunch, Margaret's mind full of new knowledge. While she prepared cornbread and heated leftover stew, she noticed Elias struggling with the accounts ledger, his finger moving slowly across the page, lips forming silent words. "The numbers don't balance," he said finally, frustration clear in his voice. Margaret looked over his shoulder, careful not to touch him. She saw the problem immediately. He'd transposed figures, turning 35 into 53. But she also saw something else. His handwriting was painfully labored, each letter formed with the concentration of a child. "Elias," she said carefully, "would you like help with the ledger?" His jaw tightened. "I manage fine." She stepped back, busying herself with the cornbread, but her teacher's instincts wouldn't let the matter rest. That evening, after supper, she pulled out the Bible and opened it to Genesis. "Would you read to me while I mend?" she asked, offering him the book. He stared at it like she'd offered him a live snake. "My eyes aren't good in lamplight." "Then I'll read." She kept her voice neutral, beginning with the familiar cadence of creation. After a few verses, she stopped. "Actually, my throat's a bit sore. Would you mind taking over?" "Margaret." His voice was low, warning. She set down her mending and looked at him directly. "You can't read, can you?" The silence stretched between them, taut as a trap spring. Finally, he shook his head. "Know some words, enough to get by in town, read simple signs. But books," he gestured at the Bible, "might as well be Greek." "Why didn't you say, man my age? Supposed to be teaching you about survival, and I can't even read a child's primer." His laugh was bitter. "What would you think of me? I'd think you were brave enough to build a life up here without needing words on paper. But if you wanted to learn..." She let the offer hang. "I'm 48 years old, Margaret. Too old for schooling." "I've taught men older than you. Immigrants at the night school in Baltimore. You already know spoken English, that's the hardest part. Reading's just matching symbols to sounds you already know." He was quiet for so long she thought he'd refuse. Then, "Could we not mention it if I'm too stupid to learn?" "You're not stupid, and it would be our business, no one else's." She fetched the McGuffey's eclectic reader she'd noticed on his shelf, level 1, designed for children but serviceable for adults if handled with dignity. She opened to the first lesson, simple 3-letter words with pictures. "We'll start with the alphabet," she said, writing the letters on her slate. "You probably know more than you think." He did know some letters, particularly those in his own name. She worked with him for an hour, patient repetition without condescension, the same technique she'd used with struggling students. He was a quick learner once he overcame his embarrassment, his finger tracing each letter as he sounded it out. The next evening, they continued. Within a week, he was reading simple sentences, his pronunciation careful and deliberate. Margaret never laughed at his mistakes, never showed impatience when he confused B and D or forgot that gish could be silent. "Why does rough not sound like though?" he asked one evening, genuine bewilderment in his voice. "Because English is a language assembled by committee, none of whom spoke to each other," Margaret replied, earning his first real laugh since they'd married. Their days fell into a pattern. Mornings were for mountain lessons. Elias teaching Margaret to identify animal tracks, predict weather, find her way by sun and stars. She learned to move quietly through the forest, to recognize the alarm calls of jays that meant predators were near, to find water by following game trails. One morning, she excited pointed to large prints in the mud by the creek. "Look, someone's dog got loose. These tracks are huge, must be a mastiff or something similar." Elias crouched beside the prints, his mouth twitching. "That's not a dog. But it has to be. Look at the size of those paw pads." "Margaret, dogs have been bred for thousands of years to be smaller than their wolf ancestors. What you're looking at there is a bear track. Black bear, probably 300 pounds. She stared at the prints, then at the brush surrounding them, suddenly aware of how many shadows could hide a bear. "It was here recently. Last night, probably. See how the edges are still sharp. Rain 2 days ago would have softened older prints." He stood, scanning the area with practiced eyes. "He's moved on. Bears don't linger where humans are active." "I thought it was a dog," she said weakly. "City girl sees what she expects to see," Elias said, but his tone was gentle. "Mountain'll teach you different. Give it time." That evening, as she worked with him on reading, she told the story on herself, laughing at her own ignorance. "A dog. Can you imagine some enormous dog roaming the mountain?" "To be fair," Elias said, concentrating on the sentence before him. "First time I saw a locomotive, I thought it was a dragon. All that smoke and noise and screaming." "How old were you, Bo? 22? She laughed until her sides hurt, and he grinned at her reaction. "Not all of us grew up with trains in our backyard, Mrs. Teacher." The reading lessons continued each evening. Margaret discovered that Elias had an excellent memory once he learned a word. He rarely forgot it. His biggest challenge was patience with himself. He wanted to read immediately, frustrated by the slow process of sounding out each word. "I can build a barn but can't read the word barn without stumbling," he muttered one evening. "You didn't learn to build a barn in a day either," Margaret reminded him. "Every skill takes time." The breakthrough came 3 weeks into their lessons. Margaret had written simple words on slates and placed them around the cabin door, stove, window, creating an immersive learning environment. She was darning socks by the fire when she heard Elias's sharp intake of breath. He sat at the table with her slate and a piece of charcoal, his hand trembling slightly as he formed 4 letters. H-O-M-E. He stared at the word he'd written, his first complete word without copying, and she saw his eyes grow wet. "Home," he whispered, running his finger under the letters. "I wrote home." Margaret rose and stood beside him, not touching but close enough that he could feel her presence. "You did? That's wonderful. Elias. Never thought I'd—" He stopped, blinking hard. "My father couldn't read either, nor his father. Seemed like something for other people. People who lived in towns and had proper schooling. And now I think maybe I was just afraid of being bad at something." He looked up at her. "You're a good teacher, Margaret. You're a good student." Their eyes met and held for a moment longer than necessary before Elias cleared his throat and returned to his writing. He practiced the word again, then added another wife. He showed it to her with shy pride. "2 words I never thought I'd write," he said. As September wore on, their mutual teaching deepened. Elias showed Margaret how to preserve meat. smoking thin strips in the smokehouse until they were hard as leather but would last through winter. She taught him about sentence structure, about periods and questions marks, about the music hiding in written words. He taught her to shoot the rifle, standing behind her to adjust her stance, his hands gentle but firm as he positioned her arms. She tried not to notice the warmth of him, the way he smelled of pine smoke and leather. The rifle kicked harder than she expected, bruising her shoulder, but she hit the target on her third try. She taught him to write his full name, Elias Jacob Crow, in smooth cursive instead of block letters. He practiced for hours, filling slate after slate with his signature until it flowed naturally. "Like I'm someone important," he said, admiring his penmanship. "You are someone important," she replied without thinking, then busied herself with starting supper to hide her blush. One evening, as October approached and the aspens turned gold, Elias read an entire page from the McGuffey Reader without help. It was a simple story about a boy and his dog, but he read it with such concentration and pride that Margaret felt tears prick her eyes. "I did it," he said, wonder in his voice. "I read a whole page." "You did. By Christmas, you'll be reading that Shakespeare I saw on your shelf." "Let's not get ahead of ourselves," he said, but he was smiling. "Maybe I'll work up to the Bible first. Seems appropriate, learning to read from the good book." They sat together at the table, the lamp casting warm light over their work. Elias practiced writing while Margaret planned the next day's lessons, both mountain curriculum and reading exercises. They were teacher and student, husband and wife, two people building something neither had expected. "Margaret," Elias said suddenly, "thank you for not giving up when I was stubborn, for making me feel like learning wasn't shameful. Thank you for teaching me to see bear tracks instead of dogs," she replied, and they both laughed. Outside, the first snow of autumn began to fall, light flurries that wouldn't stick but promised winter's approach. Inside, Elias carefully wrote a sentence he'd composed himself. "My wife teaches me to read by the fire while snow falls." Margaret read it and smiled. Perfect grammar, and true. "Best kind of sentence," Elias replied, and began writing another. "I teach my wife the mountain ways." They were learning each other's languages, she realized. He was giving her the vocabulary of survival, while she gave him the tools of written communication. Neither was complete without the other. The storm glass on the cabin wall had been falling steadily for 2 days, the liquid inside crystallizing into feathery patterns that made Elias pace the cabin like a caged bear. Margaret had learned to read his moods as clearly as he read weather signs. This restless energy meant trouble coming. "September's too early for heavy snow," she said, watching him check the window for the 10th time that morning. "Tell that to the mountain." He pointed to the peaks, where clouds were building like gray wool against the sky. "Sometimes winter comes when it pleases, not when the calendar says. That storm glass belonged to my grandfather, it's never been wrong." Margaret looked at their preparations. The woodpile was only half finished, stacked against the north wall but not yet covered. The smokehouse held venison and rabbit, but they'd planned another hunting trip before serious snow. Most worrying, the last of the vegetables remained in the garden, waiting for harvest. "How long do we have?" "Hours, maybe. When those clouds start dropping down the mountainside, we'll have minutes." They worked without discussion, each understanding what needed doing. Margaret ran to the garden with her gathering basket and a knife, cutting squash and pulling the last potatoes with desperate efficiency. The earth was already cold, and she had to dig deep to find the tubers. Her hands went numb, but she kept digging, knowing these potatoes might mean the difference between comfort and hunger in February. Elias dragged the oilskin tarps from the barn, fighting wind that had risen from nowhere, trying to cover the exposed woodpile. The tarps whipped and snapped like living things, requiring rocks and logs to hold them down. He worked with grim determination, securing their fuel supply against moisture that would make it useless. The temperature dropped 20 degrees in an hour. Margaret's fingers fumbled with the squash vines, barely able to grip the knife. She looked up to see the clouds descending exactly as Elias had predicted, rolling down the mountainside like an avalanche of gray cotton. "Get inside!" Elias shouted over the rising wind. "Now." She ran for the cabin, her basket only 3/4 full, vegetables abandoned in the garden. The first snow hit as she reached the porch, not gentle flakes but hard pellets driven horizontal by wind. Elias was right behind her, his arms full of kindling he'd grabbed from the uncovered pile. Inside, they stood panting, watching through the window as the world disappeared. The storm didn't build gradually, it arrived all at once. A white wall that erased the barn, the garden, everything beyond 10 feet from the cabin. The smokehouse, Margaret said suddenly. The door, did you latch it properly? Elias was already putting on his coat. Stay here. You can't go out in that. You won't find your way back. I've got rope in the barn for just this purpose. He wound a scarf around his face, leaving only his eyes visible. If I'm not back in 10 minutes, don't come looking. Promise me. Elias. Promise. I promise, she whispered. He disappeared into the white void. Margaret counted seconds, watching the door, the rope playing out behind him like an umbilical cord connecting him to safety. She reached 305 minutes before she saw the rope go slack. He was coming back. He stumbled through the door covered in snow, ice already forming on his beard. Smokehouse is secure, but this is worse than I thought. Look at the roof. She followed his gaze up and heard it, the groaning of wood under weight. It wasn't meant to bear. Snow was accumulating faster than she'd thought possible, and the cabin's roof, built for normal winter loads, was protesting. Is it going to hold? Should. I built it strong, but... He was listening to the beams like a doctor listening to a patient's chest. We need to be ready to shore it up if... The crack was explosive, sharp as a rifle shot. In the center of the main room, the primary beam that ran the length of the cabin split visibly, sagging in the middle. Sawdust and 8 years of accumulated dust sifted down like deadly snow. Get the support poles from the barn, Margaret said, her teacher's voice emerging calm, authoritative. I'll get the furniture in position. You can't. Go. I know what to do. Elias ran back into the storm while Margaret dragged the heavy table directly under the sagging beam. She climbed up, pressing her hands against the wood, feeling it bow under the snow's weight. If it failed completely, the entire roof would come down. Elias crashed through the door with 2 poles, each 8 feet long and thick as his arm. Hold it steady. Margaret braced herself on the table, pushing up against the beam with all her strength while Elias wedged the first pole into position. The wood groaned, but held. He positioned the second pole, creating a temporary support structure. The pine pitch, Margaret said, jumping down from the table. In your workshop supplies, we can seal the crack. They worked together with the efficiency of long partnership rather than a month-old marriage. Margaret heated the pine pitch on the stove until it was liquid, while Elias reinforced the support poles with additional bracing. She climbed back up, carefully spreading the pitch along the crack, the resin filling the split and hardening almost immediately in the cold air. It won't hold forever, Elias said, but it should get us through the storm. They stood together, looking up at their improvised repair. Margaret's hands were covered in pitch, her dress torn at the shoulder from catching on the rough wood. Elias had a cut on his forehead from the barn, blood mixing with melting snow. Let me tend that, she said, guiding him to a chair. She cleaned the wound with water warmed on the stove, gentle despite her shaking hands. The cut wasn't deep, but head wounds bled dramatically. She found the laudanum in the medicine box, but Elias waved it away. Save it for real emergencies. This is just a scratch. As she worked, the storm raged outside, wind howling like wolves, snow building against the windows until they were white blankets. The cabin felt smaller, cut off from the world, floating in a sea of white violence. We could have died, Margaret said quietly, securing a bandage around his head. But we didn't. We worked together, solved the problem. He caught her hand, pitch-stained and trembling. You were brilliant. How did you know about the pine pitch? I read about it in one of your building books. Shipbuilders use it to seal hulls. I thought if it could keep water out, it might hold wood together. My wife the scholar, he said, and there was pride in his voice. They huddled by the fire as darkness fell, though it was hard to tell day from night in the storm's perpetual twilight. The buffalo hide blankets were pulled from storage, wrapped around them as they sat close together, sharing warmth. The support beams held, though occasionally the cabin creaked ominously. I haven't seen a September storm this bad since the year Jenny died, Elias said suddenly. Margaret waited, knowing he would continue if he wanted to. She was pregnant, 7 months along. Storm came like this one, no warning. She went into labor, the stress, the fear, maybe just bad timing. His voice was steady but distant, like he was reading from a book about someone else's life. I couldn't get her down the mountain, couldn't get help up. She labored for 2 days while the storm raged. Oh, Elias. She was so strong, Margaret, stronger than me. Even at the end, she was trying to comfort me, telling me it wasn't my fault. But it was. I brought her up here. I thought I could keep her safe. Margaret turned to face him, seeing tears tracking down his weathered cheeks. It wasn't your fault. You couldn't have known. I've been hiding up here ever since. 8 years of hiding from the fact that mountains don't care about your plans or your promises. They just are what they are. And yet you brought me up here. He looked at her then, really looked at her. You're different. You didn't come here for love or romance. You came here practical, knowing the bargain. And today, you didn't panic. You just solved problems. I was terrified, Margaret admitted. When you went out to the smokehouse, when the beam cracked, I thought I was going to lose. She stopped, unsure how to finish. Lose what? My partner, she said finally. My friend, the man who's teaching me to read bear tracks and build fires and survive. I can't do this alone. Elias, I don't want to do this alone. The wind screamed around the cabin, but inside, there was sudden quiet between them. Elias reached out, touching her face with one rough finger, tracing the line of exhaustion and fear in something else. You won't be alone. I promise you that. Margaret leaned into his touch, just slightly, just enough. Tell me about her, about Jenny, not how she died, how she lived. So he did. As the storm raged and the fire crackled, he told her about the woman who'd brought curtains to a mountain cabin, who'd insisted on china plates for Sunday dinner even with no one to impress, who'd sung while she worked and laughed at his attempts to dance, who'd made the cabin feel less like shelter and more like home. She would have liked you, he said finally, would have appreciated your education, your determination, would have laughed at you thinking bear tracks were dog prints. I would have liked her too, Margaret said. Any woman brave enough to love you must have been remarkable. Love, Elias repeated, as if tasting the word. Is that what we're doing here, Margaret? I don't know, she admitted. But when that beam cracked, when you were out in the storm, all I could think was that I couldn't bear to lose you. Not yet. Not when we're just beginning to know each other. He pulled her closer, and she rested her head on his shoulder. They sat that way as the storm gradually exhausted itself. The wind dying from a scream to a moan to a whisper. The support beams held. The fire burned steady. And 2 people who'd started as strangers discovered that crisis had transformed them into something neither loneliness nor convenience could explain. When dawn finally came, pale and uncertain through the white-covered windows, they were still sitting together. Elias stirred first, gently extracting himself from their shared cocoon of blankets. I should check the damage, see if we can dig out. Margaret caught his hand. Elias. Whatever this is, partnership, friendship, or something more, I choose it. I choose you. Storm and all. He squeezed her hand, then brought it to his lips in a gesture so gentle it made her heart skip. I choose you too, Margaret. Storm and all. October painted Eagle Peak in shades of gold and rust, the aspens shimmering like coins against the evergreens. The early storm had melted away, leaving only the highest peaks white-capped. But its message was clear: winter was coming, and they weren't ready. "We need supplies," Elias said over breakfast, studying his ledger. "More than I can carry on one horse. Might need to hire Master's wagon for part of the way up." Margaret looked at her own list: salt for preserving, canning supplies, wool for winter clothes, lamp oil to see them through the dark months. "How much can we afford?" "Storm set us back. Lost time trapping while we repaired." He showed her the figures, his handwriting much improved from their evening lessons. "But we've got enough, if we're careful." And Masters extends credit to folks he trusts. "Why? Does he trust you?" "He did, before I married a stranger at the courthouse." Elias's mouth quirked in what might have been a smile. "Suppose we'll find out if that's changed." They descended the mountain 2 days later, both riding this time, with the pack horse trailing behind. Margaret wore her practical clothes, the brown calico, the sturdy boots, a man's coat Elias had altered to fit her. Her Baltimore finery remained folded in her trunk, artifacts of a different life. The trail seemed less frightening now, though Margaret still gripped the saddle horn at the narrow passages. She knew these paths now, recognized the lightning-struck pine at the halfway point, the rock formation that looked like a praying man, the meadow where they'd stopped to rest the horses. Cedar Falls appeared larger somehow, or perhaps she'd grown smaller in her mountain isolation. The streets seemed impossibly wide, the buildings unnaturally square and confined. People stared as they rode in the hermit and his mail-order bride returning to civilization. "Let them look," Elias murmured, riding close beside her. "We've got nothing to be ashamed of." They hitched the horses outside Master's general store. The interior was crowded with Saturday shoppers, women fingering fabrics, men discussing the price of grain. Conversation stuttered to a stop when they entered. "Elias, Mrs. Crow." Masters hurried forward, genuinely pleased. "Heard you weathered that early storm. Everything all right up there?" "Roof held," Elias said simply. "Need supplies for winter." They worked through their list methodically, Masters tallying figures on his slate. Margaret selected carefully the cheapest salt, bulk quantities to save money, only the essentials. She was comparing thread prices when she heard the voice that froze her blood. "Margaret, Margaret Hale." She turned slowly, as if moving through honey. Harold Westbrook stood in the doorway, dressed in a city suit that looked absurd in the frontier store. He was exactly as she remembered, sandy hair precisely parted, weak chin disguised by waxed mustache, pale hands that had never known hard work. But something was different. His eyes held a desperation she'd never seen before. "It's Mrs. Crow now," she said, surprised by her steady voice. "Yes, I heard." Harold stepped closer, and she smelled his pomade, overwhelming after weeks of pine and wood smoke. "Margaret, I've come to apologize, to explain, to make things right." The store had gone silent, everyone pretending to shop while obviously listening. Margaret felt Elias move closer, not touching, but present, a mountain at her back. "There's nothing to explain, Mr. Westbrook. You made your choice clear." "But I was wrong." The words burst from him. "Lillian. That's the girl I was going to. She changed her mind. Said I was too old, too set in my ways. Her parents forced me to pay for breach of promise." His laugh was bitter. "Ironic. Isn't it? I rejected you for being too old. Then was rejected myself for the same reason." "I'm sorry for your disappointment," Margaret said formally, though she felt no sympathy at all. "But don't you see? We can fix this now. I've reconsidered. 46 isn't so old. Really. You're still, that is, you look well. Mountain air agrees with you." He reached for her hand. "We could still marry, just as we planned. I've kept the house ready. The lady said she's Mrs. Crow now." Elias's voice was quiet but carried the weight of mountains. He stepped beside Margaret, his hand gentle but firm on her elbow, and she felt the claiming in it not possession, but protection. Harold looked at Elias properly for the first time, taking in the breadth of him, the scarred hands, the weathered face. Surely this was just a matter of convenience. Margaret needed protection, and you, well, I'm sure you meant well. Mr. Elias Crow, her husband. Yes, but Harold turned back to Margaret, his voice taking on a wheedling quality she remembered from his letters. Margaret, be practical. You can't want to live on a mountain with a trapper. You're educated, refined. You belong in a proper house with proper society. I can give you that. I realize now that your maturity is actually an asset. You won't be silly like young girls. You'll run my household efficiently, like a piece of furniture that's functional rather than decorative. Margaret's voice could have frozen water. How flattering, Mr. Westbrook. That's not what I meant. It's exactly what you meant. You want a housekeeper you can marry rather than pay. Someone grateful enough for respectability that she won't complain when you treat her like staff. She straightened her shoulders. I was that desperate woman at the train station, but I'm not her anymore. You'd rather live in primitive conditions with an illiterate mountain man than my husband reads to me every evening by the fire. The pride in her voice stopped Harold mid-sentence. He's learning Shakespeare. Last night he read Sonnet 116 without stumbling once. Let me not to the marriage of true minds admit impediments. Elias's hand tightened on her elbow, and she saw his throat work as he swallowed hard. This is ridiculous, Harold said, his face flushing red. You're throwing away respectability for what some romantic notion of frontier life. You'll be begging to come back by Christmas when the snow traps you up there. Then that will be my choice to make, Margaret said. Just as it was your choice to send that telegram. We all must live with our choices. Mr. Westbrook. Harold opened his mouth for another protest, but Elias shifted slightly, not a threat, just a repositioning that somehow made his size more apparent. Harold stepped back. Margaret, please. I'm staying at the hotel. Room 3. If you change your mind. She won't. Elias's statement was simple, factual, then louder, addressing the store. My wife and I have business to complete. Masters, can you deliver these supplies to the foot of the trail tomorrow? I'll bring the horses down to pack them up. Of course, Elias, and... Masters made a show of checking his ledger. Your credit's good here. Always has been. Man who pays his debts and keeps his word, that's the kind of customer I want. The vote of confidence rippled through the store. Mrs. Masters emerged from behind the fabric counter with a wrapped package. For you, Mrs. Crow, some of that rose-scented soap from Denver, a wedding gift we never got to give you. Other townspeople nodded, murmured congratulations, shifted their allegiance from the exciting scandal to the established couple. Harold stood isolated in the center of the store, his city suit marking him as the outsider now. Margaret accepted the soap with genuine pleasure. Thank you, Mrs. Masters. That's very kind. They finished their shopping with Harold still standing there, diminishing with each normal interaction, each casual acceptance of the Crows as a married couple. When they finally left, Margaret didn't look back. Outside, Elias helped her mount, his hands lingering at her waist. Sonnet 116's. I might have been showing off a little, she admitted. You knew it by heart. Every teacher knows that one. Love is not love which alters when it alteration finds. It seemed appropriate. They rode out of town side by side, the pack horse loaded with what Masters could fit. Margaret felt eyes on them from windows and doorways, but the weight of judgment had shifted. She wasn't the abandoned woman anymore. She was Mrs. Elias Crow, the woman who'd chosen the mountain over comfort, partnership over propriety. They were 3 miles out of town before Elias spoke again. You could have gone with him. No, Margaret said simply. I couldn't have. He could give you things I can't. A real house, society, the life you were raised for. Margaret pulled her horse to a stop, forcing him to stop too. "Elias, look at me." He did, and she saw the vulnerability there, the fear that she might still leave, that Harold's offer might grow more tempting as winter deepened. "Harold offered me a position, not a partnership, a role to play, not a life to build." She reached across the space between horses, taking his hand. "You gave me your truth from the beginning. No false promises, no pretty lies, just honest work and honest company. That all, and reading lessons by lamplight, and wildflowers in a mason jar, and standing beside me today, not because you had to, but because you chose to." She squeezed his hand. "You called me your wife with pride. First time you've done that." "Meant it," he said roughly. "When he reached for you, when he tried to take you away." He stopped, struggling for words. "I wanted to break his hand. Not very civilized of me. But you didn't. You just stood there, being yourself. And that was enough." She smiled. "You let me fight my own battle while making sure I knew I wasn't fighting alone." They continued up the trail as afternoon shadows lengthened, at the meadow where they usually rested. Elias surprised her by pulling out a small package from his saddlebag. "Bought this while you were looking at thread," he said, handing it over. Inside was a book, Jane Eyre by Charlotte Bronte. The pages were worn, clearly second-hand, but the binding was solid. "Masters said it was about a woman who was stronger than she looked," Elias explained. "Thought you might, that is, when I can read better. Maybe you could teach me this one." Margaret clutched the book to her chest, tears pricking her eyes. "It's perfect. Thank you." "There's something else." He pulled out a small leather pouch. "Was going to wait until Christmas, but after today." Inside were 2 simple gold bands, worn but genuine. Wedding rings. "They were my parents," he said. "Had them in the cabin all this time. Couldn't bring myself to sell them even when times were lean. Would you wear one?" Margaret held out her left hand without hesitation. The ring was too large, but Elias had wrapped thread around the back to make it fit. He slipped it onto her finger with careful reverence. "Now you," she said, taking the larger band. His hand shook slightly as she placed the ring. They sat on their horses in the middle of a mountain meadow, properly married at last, no judge or witness except the peaks and the endless sky. "Harold was wrong," Elias said finally. "You won't be begging to leave come Christmas." "How do you know?" "Because you're not here hiding from something, like I was. You're here building something." He turned his horse back to the trail. "Come on, Mrs. Crow, let's go home." They climbed toward Eagle Peak as the sun set behind them, painting the mountains purple and gold. Tomorrow they would retrieve the rest of their supplies, continue preparing for winter, but tonight they would read by the fire, wearing rings that declared what Harold Westbrook would never understand, that love could grow in the most unlikely soil, between the most unlikely people, strong as mountains and twice as enduring. Margaret looked at the ring on her finger, this circle of gold that weighed nothing and everything. In the general store, Elias had called her his wife with pride. Now, riding beside him toward their cabin, she understood the word meant more than law or paper. It meant choosing each other, over and over, in storms and sunshine, in plenty and want. "Elias," she called as they neared the cabin. "Thank you for today, for everything." He looked back at her, and his smile transformed his weathered face. "No, Margaret, thank you for choosing this, for choosing us." The cabin appeared through the trees. Smoke rising from the chimney, Elias had banked the fire perfectly to last their absence. It looked small from here, insignificant against the vastness of mountains and sky. But Margaret saw it differently now, not as a shelter or a hiding place, but as a home, their home. Harold would never understand what he'd really offered her in that telegram. Not rejection, but redirection. Not an ending, but a beginning she could never have imagined when she'd boarded that train in Baltimore, dressed in her finest clothes and believing her life was already written. The mountain had rewritten her story, and she was only just beginning to read it. The first real snow of winter came on October 15th, not with the violence of September's storm, but with quiet determination, falling steadily through the night until the world wore white like a wedding dress. Margaret woke to the peculiar brightness that comes when snow reflects morning sun, the cabin filled with light that seemed to come from everywhere at once. She found Elias already outside, shoveling a path from the cabin to the barn, his breath making clouds in the crisp air. They'd learned from the early storm everything was secured, supplies protected, firewood covered and accessible. This time, they were ready. "Coffee's hot," she called from the porch. He leaned on his shovel, looking at her with an expression she couldn't quite read. "Been thinking," he said. "Dangerous habit." "Maybe." He went back to shoveling, but she could tell his mind was elsewhere. "Been thinking about Harold Westbrook." Margaret's stomach tightened. It had been 3 days since their trip to town, 3 days of careful normalcy, neither mentioning the encounter that had changed something fundamental between them. What about him? "He was wrong about you begging to leave by Christmas, but he was right about one thing." Elias stopped shoveling, meeting her eyes across the snowy distance. "This isn't the life you were meant for." "Elias, let me finish." He came closer, stopping at the bottom of the porch steps. "You were meant for education, for teaching, for books and culture. Instead, you're here, hauling water and smoking meat and mending clothes by lamplight." "I chose this," Margaret said firmly. "I know. That's what I've been thinking about. You chose it. You choose it every day, every time you could complain but don't. Every time you solve problems instead of expecting me to fix them. Every time you teach me letters without making me feel stupid." He climbed the steps, standing close enough that she could see snow crystals melting in his beard. "I need to tell you something." Margaret waited, her hands wrapped around her coffee cup for warmth and steadiness. "I've been moving my things," he said quietly. "Little by little, a shirt here, my shaving kit there. They're by the door of the main bedroom now." Your bedroom. She'd noticed. Of course. How could she not? His belongings appearing like shy visitors at the threshold of the room she still thought of as hers rather than theirs. "I didn't want to presume," he continued. "We agreed to partnership. Not this. But Margaret, He stopped, looking away. "I don't know how to say it right." "Then say it wrong," she whispered. "I love you." The words came out rushed, desperate. "Not like I loved Jenny, that was young love, all fire and desperation. This is different, quieter, like how the mountains love the sky, just by being there, constant and true." He looked at her then, vulnerable as she'd never seen him. "Is that too much? Have I ruined what we have?" Margaret set down her coffee cup with trembling hands. Then, without a word, she took his hand and led him inside, past the main room with its repaired beam, past his pile of belongings waiting like a question at her bedroom door. She stopped at the threshold, turning to face him. "Do you know what I thought when I first saw this room?" she asked. "I thought it was a kindness, you giving me privacy, space, dignity, and it was... But somewhere between learning to read bear tracks and teaching you to read words, I started hoping you'd cross this threshold. Margaret, I love you too. Elias. Not the love I thought I wanted when I answered Harold's advertisement that was about security and respectability. This is about choosing to build something together, one day at a time." She stepped backward into the room, still holding his hand, drawing him across the threshold. "Come home." He kissed her then, their first real kiss, tender and careful and tasting of coffee and promise. His hands framed her face like she was something precious, something that might break or disappear if he held too tight. "Are you sure?" he asked against her lips. "I've never been more sure of anything." They moved his things together, hanging his clothes beside hers, placing his shaving kit next to her brush and mirror. Such simple acts, but they felt momentous, two lives becoming one life, shared and whole. That night, as snow continued to fall, they lay together in the bed that was now theirs. Elias traced patterns on her shoulder with one calloused finger, writing words she couldn't see but felt in her bones. "What are you writing?" she asked. "Wife," he said. "Beloved, mine." "Write something else," she said, guiding his hand to her heart. "What? Forever." Winter deepened around them, but inside the cabin, something new bloomed. They worked together with an ease that came not from routine but from choosing to share space, warmth, life. The reading lessons continued. But now Elias read to her in bed, stumbling over Shakespeare's sonnets with determined passion. She taught him the language of books. He taught her the language of touch. In December, when the snow was too deep for travel, Margaret realized she'd missed her monthly courses. Then again in January, by February. She couldn't ignore the changes in her body, the tenderness, the nausea that came with morning coffee, the bone-deep exhaustion that had nothing to do with mountain work. "I think I'm with child," she told Elias one evening as he practiced writing in his journal another new habit, recording their days in his improving hand. The pencil fell from his fingers. "I'm 47 years old," she said, fear creeping into her voice. "It's dangerous. I know. Maybe impossible. My mother always said women my age shouldn't." He pulled her into his lap, holding her tight. "Don't," he said fiercely. "Don't think like that. We're not them your mother, Jenny, anyone else. We're us. We're different." "But what if? Then we'll face it together, whatever comes." He placed his hand on her still flat stomach with wonder. "A baby. Our baby." They told no one at first, guarding the secret through the remaining winter months. Elias treated her like spun glass, trying to take over all heavy work until she firmly reminded him that mountain women had been having babies for generations. "I'm pregnant, not broken," she said, continuing to haul water and tend fires, though she let him take over the wood chopping. When spring finally came and the trails cleared, they made the journey to town. Dr. Morrison, new to Cedar Falls since Margaret's arrival, was young enough to be their son, but old enough to have delivered dozens of babies. "Everything seems normal," he said after his examination. Margaret dressed again and sitting beside Elias. "The baby's position is good, heartbeat strong." "You're healthy, Mrs. Crow. I see no reason for unusual concern." "But her age," Elias began, "is a factor, yes. But your wife is strong, well-nourished, and clearly thriving in mountain air." The doctor smiled. "I've delivered babies from women older than Mrs. Crow. Sometimes the ones who wait longest are the ones who want it most, and that determination matters." They walked out of the doctor's office into a world transformed by possibility. The aspens were budding green, the creek running high with snowmelt. Life surged everywhere in the returning birds, the emerging wildflowers, the child growing beneath Margaret's heart. "We need to prepare," Elias said, his mind already working. "A cradle, clothes, blankets." "We have time," Margaret said, taking his arm. "The baby won't come until October." "October," he repeated, then smiled. "A year after our first real snow together." Oh, they climbed back to Eagle Peak with their secret now shared, official, real. Elias began work on a cradle that very night, selecting pine from his woodpile, sanding it smooth as silk. Margaret started a baby quilt, using scraps from her worn Baltimore dresses, creating something new from remnants of her old life. Summer passed in preparation and growth. Margaret's body changed, rounding with life while Elias read to her stomach each night, his voice rumbling through fairy tales and Bible verses. They worked the garden together, preserving food for the winter that would come with a new mouth to feed. The baby came on October 20th, after 12 hours of labor that seemed both endless and brief. The midwife from town, summoned when Margaret's pains began, was a steady presence. But it was Elias's hand Margaret gripped. His voice she focused on, as he actually read from Psalms. The mountains skipped like rams, but he read, voice shaking only slightly. And the little hills like lambs. Their daughter arrived with the dawn, screaming her fury at the cold world, then settling when placed on Margaret's chest. She had Elias's dark hair and Margaret's stubborn chin, and when she opened her eyes, they were the gray of winter skies. "She's perfect," Elias whispered, touching the baby's tiny fist with one finger. "What should we call her?" Margaret looked at their daughter. This impossible gift. This child who shouldn't exist but did. "Hope," she said. "Hope Elizabeth Crow." "Hope," Elias repeated, and cried without shame. 1 year later, the cabin rang with laughter, Hope's delighted giggles as Elias read from the McGuffey reader, making silly voices for each character. She sat in his lap at the table, pudgy fingers reaching for the pages, trying to eat the book that had brought her parents together. "No, little one," Margaret said, rescuing the primer. "Books are for reading, not eating." She was teaching again, in a way. 3 families from lower down the mountain sent their children up once a week for lessons. The cabin's main room had become a schoolhouse on Wednesdays, filled with young voices learning letters and numbers. "Mrs. Crow, is it true Mr. Crow couldn't read when you married him?" young Sally Masters had asked last week. "It's true," Margaret had said, watching Elias's face. "But he learned. It's never too late to learn. My pa says Mr. Crow reads better than the preacher now." Elias had blushed, but Margaret saw his pride. He did read well now, confidently, hungrily, making up for lost decades. Their evenings were still spent by the fire, but now he read to her as often as she to him, Hope drowsing between them. "She's growing so fast," Margaret said now, watching Hope pull herself up using Elias's beard as a handhold. "Walking before we know it, then running, then asking to go to town for schooling, then getting married." Elias's voice was mournful, making Margaret laugh. "We have time," she said, echoing her words from over a year ago. Years and years of time. A knock at the door interrupted them, unusual for evening. Elias handed Hope to Margaret and answered it, revealing Masters from the general store, hat in hand. "Sorry to intrude," Masters said. "But there's a woman at the depot. Came in on the evening train. She's in a situation. Husband-to-be took one look and left her standing there. Sound familiar?" Margaret stood, Hope on her hip. "Bring her here." "Margaret," Elias began, "we have the barn loft. It could be made comfortable." She met his eyes. "Someone gave me a chance when I needed it most." Elias studied her face, then nodded. "Bring her up, Masters. We'll make room." After Masters left, they stood together in their cabin that had become so much more than shelter. The walls held their story now in the books on shelves Elias had built, in the quilts Margaret had sewn, in the cradle where Hope had slept, in the repaired beam that had held through storms. "No regrets?" Elias asked, pulling her close. "How could I regret this?" Margaret gestured at their life, their daughter, their home, their chosen love. "Harold Westbrook did me the greatest favor of my life when he sent that telegram. Remind me to thank him if we ever see him again." "With your fists, with words," Elias said, grinning. "I know how to use those now." Hope babbled something that sounded almost like book, and they both turned to her with delight. Their daughter, born of impossible love and determination, reaching already for the thing that had brought them together. Outside, snow began to fall again, the first of their 3rd winter together. But inside, the fire was warm, the baby was laughing, and 2 people who'd thought their stories were over had discovered they were just beginning. Margaret picked up Jane Eyre, the book Elias had given her that day in the meadow. She'd taught him to read it over the summer, and now he could recite whole passages from memory. "Read to us," she said, handing him the book. He opened to a marked page, their favorite passage, and read in his deep voice while snow whispered against windows and hope settled against Margaret's chest. "I have for the first time found what I can truly love. I have found you. You are my sympathy, my better self, my good angel. I am bound to you with a strong attachment. Margaret closed her eyes, listening to her husband read words another woman had written, but that felt crafted for them, two souls who'd climbed a mountain and found each other at the peak, building a love that was all the stronger for coming late, for being chosen rather than fallen into. The mountain had brought them together, but they had chosen to stay. And in that choosing, day after day, season after season, they had discovered that the greatest adventure wasn't in the climbing, but in the arriving not at a place, but at a life shared, complete, and utterly their own. You know, friend. Sometimes I think about Margaret standing on that train platform, telegram crumbling in her hand, and I wonder if she really knew that Harold's rejection was actually her liberation. We spend so much time mourning what we've lost that we can't see what we're about to find. Family isn't always what we plan. Margaret thought it would be Harold's respectable house and proper marriage. Elias thought he'd lost his only chance with Jenny. But family, real family, is what happens when two broken people decide to build something whole together. It's teaching a man to read by lamplight. It's learning bear tracks from dog prints. It's holding up a cracking beam in a storm and discovering you're stronger together than apart. I've learned that gratitude isn't just for the good times, it's for the redirections disguised as rejections. The storms that show us who'll stand beside us. The mountains that teach us we're capable of climbing higher than we imagined. Margaret was grateful, in the end, for that telegram. Not because the hurt didn't matter, but because the hurt led her home. Sometimes the life we're meant to live is nothing like the one we planned. Sometimes it's infinitely better.